Heard on Thursdays with Nikki is about to go live online. Catch HOT, the iconic radio show that made Philippine FM radio talk, every Thursday on the Monster.
Streaming video on the Monster Facebook page at RX931, the Monster YouTube channel at RX931, and twitch.tv/Monster RX931.
Your Heard on Thursdays host, Nikki Porter. Stand by and enjoy the program.
Monsters, it's Nikki Porter, and welcome to the show that made Philippine FM radio talk. This is Heard on Thursdays on the Monster. Now, author Ursula Cohopt once said, "Chocolate is happiness you can eat." Agree. And well, we fully agree to that, but there's just something so comforting and sensual about enjoying any sort of chocolate. According to a survey, actually, and this is just FYI for all of you guys tuned in, 23% of women actually said that they enjoyed chocolate more than they enjoyed sex. And if they had to pick between the two, 57% would rather cut back on sex. Fun fact for the night. So why don't you go get some chocolate from the pantry or fridge or in that stash? We all have a stash, right, at home. So go ahead and grab that chocolate. You deserve it. Go treat yourself to it. And while you do that, munch on it while we're having this conversation tonight, because tonight I will have our guest, NYC-based pastry chef and chocolatier Daniel Corpuz. So as a graduate of the Culinary Institute of America, aka the other CIA, Daniel achieved his associate's degree in baking and pastry and his bachelor's degree in food business administration in 2019. So he's also worked in several fine dining restaurants in New York City, of which include The Modern at MoMA, Manhattan, and One White Street. As a result of the pandemic, though, Daniel shifted to work primarily with chocolate, creating bonbons, confections, and showpieces. His extensive work with chocolate, especially during a turbulent time in the food industry, yielded the opportunity to be on Netflix's new show, School of Chocolate. Yes, gasp. So this was so amazing also because this allowed Daniel to work closely with world-renowned pastry chef Amaury Guichon. So utilizing his Filipino-American background, he ultimately decided to launch his own store called Daniel Corpuz Chocolatier, and the chocolate brand does center on his upbringing while amplifying his industry experience by utilizing Filipino and Asian ingredients and flavors into his chocolates. Now, I've talked enough already, but let's get into it. Heard on Thursdays, let's welcome to the show, Daniel Corpuz. Hey!
Hi there.
Yay, good evening. Welcome to the show, Daniel. Thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, and super tansya that you were also here, or that you're here and you had the time to actually be on the show, because I know you have a lot planned while you're here in Manila. So since you've arrived,
yes,
what have you been up to?
I guess, I'm a workaholic. Let's start with that. So really, I just can't come here for vacation.
Really?
So,
Even just family go to the beach?
I guess this weekend, right? My family and I are going to Taal.
Oh,
so
okay.
we're leaving Manila for a little bit.
Okay.
But since coming back, it's been quite busy and hectic still. Since my last trip in March, now I did classes and partnership with RO Chocolate while I was here in March. This time I'm working with small businesses to create a few pop-ups while I'm here in the Philippines.
That's awesome. So I want to know, how I usually like to start the show, I want to get to know your background. What's your origin story, right? So I read from some articles that during your childhood, you were touted as a very picky eater.
Yes.
So you already have you have your laurels of being a pastry chef, having your own store also in New York City. But back then, would you even imagine maybe let's say 10-year-old Daniel being a pastry chef now? Like, what were your meals back then?
See, it's funny. As you were just talking about origin story, it's always starts with that. Because if you ask like 10-year-old Daniel, he'd be like, you're crazy. There's no way that you would be working in food. Because growing up, talagang kanin lang yung kinakain ko. Walang ulam.
Wait,
sauce,
what? No, walang
like
ulam?
white rice as it is.
Oh my god.
In terms, like, it's crazy because one of my last papers back at CIA was centered around, your culinary adventure. And I talked about how I should be very much be dead right now as a malnourished child eating just white rice, but somehow I made it. And by chance lang na naging pastry chef ako.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
And that kid that just ate white rice was really introduced to food through baking. Right? I think in like the 2010s, a lot of shows were like popping up in the US, especially on Food Network.
Yeah.
Cupcakes were like the biggest thing back
gosh,
then. I'm sure
so true.
People might remember that. And that's kind of how the whole culinary adventure began. And just to give kind of like how severe my diet was back then, I always explain it like this, right? Of course, white rice, right? You're like, okay, you're already crazy. But pizza, right? I'm sure like we're all very like fond of pizza.
Of course.
My first full slice of pizza was actually in 7th grade. Because I would always just eat the crust as a kid,
What?
right?
Oh my gosh!
So that's how insane it was.
Well, I am very glad that you were on this path now.
Right? I think that it shows real like character growth and development.
Yeah.
And we love that. So.
Yeah, we love the character development over here because it's just like, so wait, I just also wanna know, like, just white rice, was there any ulam that you thought was acceptable though?
I guess like I would eat like chicken, of course, like fried chicken. Very Filipino of me.
Yeah.
Fried chicken would be acceptable, but it could not be with the white rice.
What?
Like it would be separate. So I would eat the chicken first or the white rice first,
Oh
but
my
that was how it was.
Gosh, wow. All right, learning a lot already in the second question for this evening. So, okay, how old were you then? So you had this whole picky eater phase in your life, but how old were you eventually when you had that moment when you were like, hey, you know what, let's try this baking thing?
It was definitely like 7th grade. So like, what is that for US? It's like when I was 12. It just so happened that, I was clicking through channels and I stumbled upon like the Food Network.
Yeah.
And like I, kind of like brought up, cupcakes were the biggest thing back then. So that's kind of how I started baking. And it's funny because most people who start baking usually start with cakes. It's like, let me start with cupcakes, let me start with, decorating cakes because it's easy, or you see everyone doing it, so it's a bit more acceptable, and that's usually the gateway drug into the pastry industry, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And then as you are in it for a long time or for a while, that's when you start to find your facet in a way, right? So baking pastry encapsulates, bread, chocolate, wedding cake design,
A lot, yeah.
Dessert, like plated desserts, and so on. So it's everything.
Yeah, and actually for me, like, I'm not professionally baking, but then it's like, I was afraid of making cakes. I was the opposite because I was like, I was intimidated by it. I'm like, I'm not artistic to cake decorate. I feel like I have really clumsy like hands to layer a cake. So I started out with like brownies. It's like simple, just cut them after they're done, and then you can serve them.
It's crazy because it's like most people are like, they've asked me before, it's like, do I have to be artistic to be a pastry chef? And I'm like, no, not at all, because I think food ultimately is an art, right? Once you get to that point of understanding that food can be an art, so everyone has their own interpretation, as long as it tastes good. Let's be honest first.
Right.
It can look amazing but not taste good, which is not great. But if it can look absolutely like odd or off. I've worked under a chef that's always explained food that's somewhat chaotic as organic. So even if a layered cake isn't perfect, it is just a very organic design. But at the end of the day, as long as it tastes amazing, that's what's more important.
Yeah, of course. And it's so it's like really, that's really like the turning point for you when you decided to explore more with regard to your taste buds, apart from white rice and apart from chicken separately. So you said you were channel surfing until you decided to bake. So what were like your favorite cooking shows then? What would you wait for?
I think like back then it used to be, of course, like it was back then when like Cake Boss was a big thing.
Oh, okay.
When like Sweet Genius was still a thing, and funny enough, I've met Buddy Blastro, I've met Ron Man Israel, so
that's so cool.
It's really fun to meet your idols after a while,
yeah.
right? But yeah, that was definitely like the craze back then. It's like, let me start baking. And I think, I'm sure we'll talk about it soon, but like during the pandemic, most people also were like, what am I gonna do at home? Let me bake. So
that's so true. And so, okay, you became that cake person in high school also, and it meant there was an article that mentioned like when it would come to presentations, like in the form of cardboard or a different kind of medium, you'd use cake. So can you recall one particular project then, which you presented as cake in school?
There were definitely a few, but I remember, I don't know, what's your favorite subject first? Because I'm sure I made a cake for every subject.
Science.
Okay, but I think that's crazy because that's the one I was thinking of, right? So it was like, it was instead of the traditional like trifold board or like diorama or whatever, my team and they kind of knew if Daniel was in our team, we would make a cake. Right? And it wasn't necessarily a guaranteed 100 or an A, but it was a great way to start. An edible form of a project.
Exactly.
So I remember physics in high school, we were doing like Newton's third law, whatever. And the way that I made the cake was I made like a cliff, a mini cannon, and it was supposed to just kind of like recreate or at least showcase gravity and forces and whatever. It's very like loosely based. But it gave the excuse to make cake. Right? I think definitely one of the more memorable ones was like world history, right? And I made a burlap sack of potatoes, but it was like a chocolate cake. And,
what? Wow.
So that was definitely like a very unique thing to do during high school.
Definitely.
And I definitely know that there were, friends of mine, students of mine that enjoyed, but there were also students who were like, really, we're gonna eat cake at 7 a.m. in the morning. Like, it's a little too much. So.
No, but I love like that's how the creativity started showing up for you also in terms of like making cakes. It's not just for the sake of like, it's just for the family, for family gatherings. You really made use of it in any way that you could, and specifically in school, because that was where you were spending most of your time during that time. And so, and I just wanted to share, I like that you were working with cakes as like presentations. When I was in high school, I made and that's why I mentioned science, because they were like, okay, you have to create like this parts of the cell. And I made a cookie, and I'm like with different parts of the cell. I got 100 for that.
Nice.
Anyway, so now, okay, you were baking cakes in high school. Now you're a chocolatier. When did that shift happen then from baking cakes into focusing on chocolate and experimenting on it more?
I guess we take one step back actually, right? Because high school was cake, college was I think where it was like restaurants, right? So back at CIA, I was able to kind of like, again, experience every single facet that I brought up, right? Because the way the program's structured, you spend like a class in bread, a class in cake, a class in chocolate, a class in restaurants, and so on. And my first kind of like job out of college or during college was at a Michelin restaurant at the Modern. And that's kind of what opened the eyes to like, oh wow, I can maybe work here. And I'm sure everyone who's kind of like worked in a restaurant can, we all have, I put it like this, we all have the same trauma, same experience in a way.
Agree.
Where, I think I explained it like this last time I was here in March to a lot of people, because it was when the movie The Menu was really big. Right? So it wasn't as big as it was here in the US. So I watched it for fun. But when I was in the movie theater, it really hit me and resonated with me because of how real it was. So yeah, I mean, like post graduation, that was kind of like what I was doing working in restaurants, and I initially thought like, okay, I'm gonna work my way, I'm gonna grind my way, I'm gonna need to climb the ladder, be executive pastry chef, some restaurant somewhere in New York, right?
Yeah.
And chocolate really came about, slowly, kind of like on the back burner, right? Use a metaphor in the kitchen. It was just there simmering away while I was actively working in restaurants, right? I've always been fascinated with it. But then when COVID hit, I lost my job, like kind of like most people in the food industry.
Yeah, right.
And while I was at home, I was like, what can I do? And also the second question was, what can I sell that no one else was doing? Because most people back during pandemic, at least the US, they were definitely making bread, they were making like cookies, cakes, then they would sell to friends of friends of friends of friends.
Right, yeah.
And chocolate just so happened to be something that was not being done, right? And to the caliber that I was doing,
that's true.
that it just clicked, right? I was making it for fun, right? Posting, sharing it with people on Instagram, Facebook. And then someone just messaged, like a family friend or whoever, was like, are you ever gonna sell any of this stuff? And I was like, why not? So I did. I released I sold like 20 boxes. Back then it was like 20 boxes is like amazing, right? And I remember driving like an hour, maybe even 90 minutes away from my house just to deliver these boxes.
Wow,
yeah. It was again still locked down. And I was excited by that, right? It was just a form of income in a way, but also like funded the passion for it.
Yes.
And then, it just continued to grow and grow and grow, and it hasn't stopped growing.
Yeah, now you have a shop.
Yep, and that's great accomplishment. Quite aware of that. Sometimes I forget, but people sometimes tell me, it's like, you should remember, you're in a pretty good space right now.
Yeah.
I'm like, thank you for saying that, that's one. And two, you're right. And I think this hyper growth in terms of business, which has only started about 2.5, 3 years ago in my apartment, right, with my family, has grown to a shop is insane.
That's pretty amazing. And also like the hypergrowth that you mentioned, but also because it's very niche, right? There's not a lot of chocolate makers, at least here in the Philippines, but then a Filipino chocolatier also in New York City, and doing the different kinds of confections that you do with your specific interests also, and different flavors that you want to combine to it, it really makes it stand out. And so it's totally understand. You should you should remember that you are in a very good place. And it's like with the whole Netflix thing too, right? That was amazing. But I have to ask though, with you studying in CIA, it's like it's very interesting because there's usually, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but there's usually a career path that Filipinos will take, right? If you live in the US, but did your parents then, did they want you to take the other track too?
I like how we're like beating around the bush, where it's like the stereotype is like, if you're a Filipino, are you a nurse, right? That's one. Yeah, I mean, or are you an engineer?
Yeah, but I mean, nurses make good money though, I'm just saying. But then in terms of, because there's always that expectation, but were your parents supportive with you wanting to take on a different track?
Yeah, I think like I always, the one quote to describe this is kind of like, I'm fortunate that my parents never actively squashed the dream.
I love that.
Right?
Yeah.
Where it's like, of course, tinginan sila, they're like, talaga, ano ba yung gagawin mo? In a way, right? They don't say it, but they're looking and thinking it. But they just let it happen, right? Where it's like, I think the fact that CIA was an actual college, the fact that I was able to graduate with a bachelor's degree, of course, that stability, right? I think that's kind of the main crux of that, the stereotype, if you will, was still there, having that degree. But I think, at least in the US, there is, people of my generation, there are definitely people breaking out of that mold, right? I still have friends who are nurses and engineers in very traditional fields, but there are a lot of creatives out there, whether it be, artists, people in media, people in food. We are finding our own path, if you will. And I think it does start with kind of like the generation before us, our parents, just allowing us to be able to do what we enjoy and what we love. And it can be hard at times as a business owner, as a creative myself. It can definitely be hard at times. But I think, as somebody who runs a business right now and spends most likely like 80 plus hours on it in a way, whether it be actively making it or handling social media or marketing and taking meetings and so on, like there's definitely a lot. But at the end of the day, I still very much enjoy what I do. And I think that's kind of like one of the biggest lessons that both my generation and maybe the generation before me are definitely learning. It's like, just do what you love. It's a cliche, right?
Yeah.
It's like, do what you love, you'll never work a day in your life, parang ganun. But
Yeah.
it really is, I think, I experience it myself, and I'm the biggest advocate for such.
Yeah, and I totally agree, because it's something that, you're in your own time. Granted, you do work so much more, but you're doing something, you're investing your time and energy in something you actually really want to do, and that investment in the long run will eventually pay off if you're consistent with it. So I think that's just a really amazing way of for one thing, it's amazing to have parents who are very supportive.
Yes. And I'm very grateful and thankful for them.
Yeah, so during the pandemic, you touched on this a little bit earlier. You were kind of in your own lane, right? So you were doing your own thing in your mom's kitchen and trying to share the kitchen also.
Yes.
So you were posting mini showpieces and bonbons in your socials. But when you were called to take part in School of Chocolate, what was going through your mind? Were you because I'm pretty sure you were just like out there posting in social media without really asking for anything in return.
Yeah.
And then Netflix calls.
I guess, like, first off, like, in the US, it's not uncommon for casting producers to reach out to you through through Instagram. Because Instagram, I think I tell people, it's your portfolio, right?
Yeah,
especially if you curate it,
Yes.
then it's like, that's how you can gain interest from other people. And first off, those producers never actually tell you who they're working for. So it's just
Yeah.
mostly, the way it was, hi, I'm this casting producer. We have a new show all about chocolate. We think you'd be great. Would you be willing to chat with us? That's the start, right? And during the chat, they're all under NDA, so they can't really say what the project is.
Yeah.
So they just beat around the bush as well, where it's like, it's on a popular streaming service. It's the one you're most likely thinking about, right? And like I said, I've done other interviews as well, then, where it's like, for example, there was, now that I know what the project was, it was, let's say, a Disney project, and they were like, it's a magical, whimsical theme, like, that's how they do it, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, like, it was around the time when, again, it was like May 2020, so of course, like, it was still locked down, but of course, like,
That was like 2 months.
Yeah, 2 months in, we didn't really know what was happening, whatever, so I was like, you know what, while I'm here, if you're reaching out, why not? Let's take this call. And it did interest me, so I was like, let me just, run with it. Let me just play ball. And it was like 6 or 7 Skype interviews back and forth, with the producers being like, can you make this? Can you make that? Record yourself. And luckily, one of my 3 brothers, because I'm the oldest, right? So I had 3 younger brothers. One of them, I was like, EJ, record mo ko. And he was like, and I'd wake him up at like 6 a.m. just to record me making something.
Oh my God.
So yeah, it was just like, it was fun. And like my parents, like, again, similar, they were like, what are you doing? Right? Bakit ka nagkakalat dito sa kitchen? And it was just like, and I explained to them, it's like, I think it's for a show. And it seems like they like who I am, they like the story, they like what I'm doing. So that's why I kept advancing in kind of like their interview process.
I see. And so what's interesting also is that, with School of Chocolate, the name attached to it is someone we have seen like on TikTok, on social media, on Instagram. And his name is Amory Gishon. And if you look him up, AMAURY GUICHON, if you look him up on Instagram, on TikTok, you will know what I'm talking about. It's the guy who's basically creating all of these massive chocolate showpieces, and it's just, sometimes when I watch it, I'm just like, that can't all be chocolate. Like, that's impossible. I mean, at least from like my point of view, right? So what was it like then to work with someone who is just so creative and just has full mastery of chocolate? And what was it like to work very close to Amory?
I think first off, like, Chef is somebody I've followed for years now, right? He was, like, back when he was working at, like, hotels in Vegas.
Yeah.
We all kind of were following him as people within the industry. Like, he was someone getting there. So the fact when the producers were like, hey, we can finally tell you what the show's about, you were selected, it is this is the competition. It's with Chef Amar Guichon. And I was like, oh my gosh. I was like, oh my god, because he was someone I followed and very much admired. So the fact that I was able to both meet him and work with him on the show, because of course, like, one of the questions I get all the time is like, how is he? Because in the videos you see on TikTok or Facebook or Instagram, he's very, very stoic. He doesn't really speak. He just creates.
He just creates as well.
And many people were always thinking like, oh, he's like a Gordon Ramsay. He's a mean. And I tell people, it's like, he's actually really not, right? Where it's like, we didn't know what to expect. I say again, we had never met him before.
Yeah.
And I remember, like, I think the best way to describe it is, I remember if anyone, including myself, would be struggling in a challenge, he would come over and, kind of give us guidance. And be like, he wouldn't be able to necessarily do it for us, because unfortunately I didn't even judge. Yeah. But he would be like, Daniel, hold that, do that again. Or like such small things. And it really just like speaks to kind of like what he does, right? He has a school, right? That's his job as an instructor. And it only makes sense and translates well onto the show, right? Where and I think that's why the show did well. It's kasi imbis na, everyone's cutthroat, crowd mentality. It's like, oh, I want to win. Don't get me wrong, everyone still wanted to win, but everyone also learned. And I think from that experience, I not only learned a lot of like skills in terms of pastry, but as a chef, as somebody who just like, is starting in this industry, surrounded by individuals who have been in it for decades, I very much learned a lot about myself, as well as like how I can pursue this career going forward.
Yeah, and what was interesting also, when you entered School of Chocolate, you were the youngest participant. You were 21.
Yes. Compared
to everyone else who was on the show. So, like you being like, I'm sure you took so much in, like being in that opportunity, experiencing all of that. Was there any takeaway for you on being on the show that you now apply? Being like, a full-fledged chocolatier now with your own shop in New York, like, is there one? Can you share maybe one takeaway that you've probably learned from School of Chocolate? Maybe a couple, if if there's really more than one that you have applied since in your own business.
I guess it's actually something that I wasn't necessarily able to apply as much, because like we brought up, it's hyper growth and kind of like you strike while the iron's hot. So because the show did so well and people supported, I have to continue to grow. But kind of one of the biggest advices that all the chefs gave is there is no rush, technically. There is no rush to be the executive pastry chef. There is no rush to be the top of the top. They explained it as, once you become kind of the executive pastry chef, you no longer have a stable person above you to look up to or look to for answers.
Yeah,
whereas like if you're a pastry cook, if you're a pastry sous chef, yung pag may problema, who do you look for? Oh, let me look for a chef. Because they're the ones who will find the answer. They're the ones who know the answer. Unfortunately, like I said, I was not able to necessarily heed that advice, kasi I own my own shop, and even there are days na yun where I'm like, okay, there's a problem, there's a recipe I need, who do I look to? And technically sometimes there's no one there. I think I'm glad and I'm fortunate that I've been able to surround myself with very well-experienced chefs, including Chef Amari. My problema ako, I could text him right now and be like, Chef,
that's cool.
What do you think about this? But sometimes others don't have that same network as much. So it's something that I wish I could have heeded a bit more if given the time. But I tell students that as well. Like I talk to a lot of them. It's like you don't have to rush, because once you get there, sometimes it's like, what do I do? Who do I turn to? So.
All right, so that's a takeaway, and well, I guess it makes you more resourceful though, right? I mean, if you, especially maybe you might not have the same connections, but you allow yourself to kind of get curious. Okay, well, how can I figure this out then, and kind of, figure out your own path into the solution. Now, making bonbons and confections, it's one thing. Creating larger than life showpieces is a whole different level. First of all, I don't think I would ever eat. I feel like, okay, personally, whenever I see some of your like showpieces, small or large, it's like, I don't want to eat it. It's like, it's a work of art. I just like put it in like an acrylic box or something. Even with like the bonbons, like, cause like they're like the streak of the paint or the coloring or something. It's just so beautiful that you don't want to mess it up. Like you don't want to touch it. So like, it takes a degree of artistry to put pen to chocolate. So do you need to be visually creative then? Because I feel like this is a common misconception. We talked about this off air also, that you have to be visually creative to make these showpieces, right? Because some of them actually look very realistic also. So how do you, what are the requirements? How did you get to that point for you to become creative with chocolate?
I guess like, I'll answer your last question first. Like, how did I get there, right? In terms of like, as a kid, I was always so artistic in a way, right? Where I would draw,
the cannonball one that you mentioned.
Yeah, exactly. So that does help being an artistic individual, right? But it's not like the make or break, right? Where, I remember one of the other classes back in college was actually like, it was an art class, right? So it was just like theory of art, right?
Okay.
Where it was like rule of thirds or like monochromatic versus like what colors work together.
Yeah.
So you could always go that route of like looking at it scientifically.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And I guess another way you could look at it is just like, what do you see in your own world? Right? That's some, like the influences that I usually have to decorate the bonbons is very much based on like what I see. So one of my favorite stories is actually in Black Sesame Bonbon Ca. The design of that bonbon is influenced by my time in China. I was in Beijing, and I was in this hotel. There was this huge wall with individual nails nailed at different depths.
Yeah.
So if you stepped back, this entire mural of a landscape would show up.
Yeah.
Right? But off to the very, very corner was this very small painting of a koi fish in the black and white with red dots and so on. So you're so enamored by this mural that you actually like don't even see the painting. But for me, it was kind of the opposite, where I saw the mural, but then I saw the painting. And that's kind of what influenced that design. So you definitely have to be slightly artistic, or at least like understand color theory and all that stuff. When it comes to sculptures, I think my biggest thing is if you're gonna sculpt like an animal or anything cartoony, psychologically as humans, we are able to at least give some leeway to, let's say, if your elephant looks slightly weird, if your like bird is slightly off, it's okay. Because we have seen caricatures so much.
Right.
But if you ever look at my work, I've never sculpted a human being.
Yeah.
Because and I'm sure artists would agree, drawing or sculpting human beings is actually much harder, because as human beings, we are quite familiar with how our anatomy is. If there's something slightly off, you see it. So I won't be doing any sculptures of any people anytime soon.
You won't accept commissions, like.
Oh, for that, no, I don't think so. Because it's especially if it's like of someone, and you mess it up. Oh man, I don't want to deal with that at all.
Do you know that Ronaldo stuff?
Yeah, I was thinking that right now, because I'm envisioning the meme right now where it's like him and the statue and the bust. Oh man, but exactly the point. So and then just to bookend your kind of like questions, like it is a work of art, so there are times where people are like, I wish I could save it. When it comes to the bonbons, I'm like, don't. You're supposed to eat it, right? It's gonna spoil or go bad if you don't. Yeah. But for the showpieces, like one of the last showpieces that I have right now is actually the dinosaur head from the show. Yeah. I snapped it off.
You still have it? Oh my God.
Almost 3 years later, I snapped it off at the end of the filming, and it's just at home, still there, and still alive.
Wait, it's still there? So it's like, does it have to be in an air-conditioned room? Is it in the fridge? Where did you store it?
So it is downstairs in the basement where it's slightly cooler.
Okay.
However, it has had some heat damage, so like the mouth, you could see it actually closed a bit. So it's just like slowly melting. But yeah, he's down there, and every once in a while I forget that he's there, but he's there.
I love that. It's a very unique kind of souvenir, but you have to make
My
sure
trophy.
that it's still there
Yeah.
by the time you go back down. Okay, so what is your creative process then like when it comes to creating these either it's showpieces or it's confections? Like, what is your creative process when it comes to that? If it's not commissioned, if it's something that you want to make.
I think then I'll go with the bonbons first. I
Okay.
say I don't really do much showpieces right now,
right.
just because they're passion projects and unfortunately they don't sell. So the bonbons they do sell, and I think it'll ultimately open or unlock the conversation of like the Filipino-American heritage
Yes.
and influence, right? So like I think deciding what to put on my menu very much does harken to that Filipino Asian American kind of like story, right? Where ube, for example, right now is hot. Anything ube will sell in the U.S. Okay, so like I told you off air where it's like I just did an event where I do ube ice cream and people wait 2 hours for a scoop of my ube ice cream.
It's wild.
So ube is very hot right now, but of course there's so much more than just ube.
Yeah.
So if you look at my menu, it's ube, there's a calamansi bonbon, there's a pandan bonbon. My caramelized banana is influenced by turon. My vanilla hazelnut is sanserbal. So it very much harkens to kind of like that Filipino nostalgia, right?
Nagdalakad.
Matutunaw kaya, diba? So that's the only problem here in the Philippines.
That's true. That's a good point.
But I think I had a guest show up a couple months, maybe a month ago now, and I loved her quote, and I wrote it down and I still remember it to this day, just because it really does, I think, explain how a lot of Filipino chefs are going about creating menus now.
Yeah.
She explained my bonbons as, quote, "It's like a taste of home in a Western form," close quote. And I think that's the point. Funny enough, I just ate at Metronome kanina, like literally a couple hours ago.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think I learned while I was here in March, and I'm continuing to learn on my second trip this year, ngayon, that there's so much more happening food-wise here in the Philippines that is almost similar to the US. And I can only imagine where the food scene is going to go in the next 5 years here in the Philippines.
That's true.
Because I walked away from dinner tonight telling Chef Miko, being like, this is worthy of like 2 Michelin stars, in my opinion, right? And I think like that is slowly becoming a thing here in the Philippines.
Yeah.
Where in the US it already is happening, right? Kasama is the first Filipino Michelin star restaurant.
Right.
I'm going to eat there one of these days. I haven't gone to it yet. And there's just a lot of Filipino chefs all over the US. And I think I'm trying to make my mark through chocolate, knowing that we as a country here in the Philippines also do export chocolate.
Yeah.
But not many Western chefs or chefs abroad understand or know that we do.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think, that's kind of like my mission right now is to, one, introduce Filipino cacao, Filipino chocolate to others through the shop, but also other ingredients like calamansi, like pandan, because those are ingredients that people are like, what's calamansi? What's pandan? And I think it starts with kind of like how we educate, right?
Yes.
Calamansi, for example, I always hear other Philams or Filipinos being like, it's like a lemon, it's like a lime. And I'm like, well, no, calamansi is calamansi.
It's its own,
right?
yeah, it has its own flavor.
Right? Where it's like, I think, to connect it in a different way, like yuzu, I think ubiquitously, right? Everyone understands that yuzu is its own thing.
Yes.
So I'm trying my best to get people to understand that calamansi is its own thing also. So when I explain it, it's a small citrus fruit from the Philippines.
Yeah.
It's extremely tart. And I think my connection point, at least explain it, right, is of course like that intense lime, but it still is not enough to evoke what it really is.
It's
right?
true, yeah. It really does have it has its own flavor profile compared to like lemon or lime. Yes, in the same family, but like
It's still its
it's
own
like
thing.
the black sheep, but in a good way.
Yeah,
of the
right?
family. I love that. And so, like, so you being a Filipino chocolatier, and you're based in New York City, do you feel this? Is it pressure or is it pride in being Filipino that you create these confections like that you that are inspired by Asian ingredients, by Filipino ingredients? Is it like, do you feel pressured when it comes to having to create because like, no, I gotta represent or something like that? Or is it more of like pride? It's like, I get to do this because it's like, you know, and it's in my own medium too.
I think it's 50-50, right? Of course, like growing up, I'm glad that my parents very much like, you know, they're the ones who immigrated to the U.S.
Yeah.
And you know, growing up, they very much like at least instilled this very Filipino-ness, right?
Yeah.
Technically, I can still do speak Tagalog, right?
Yeah.
Because the rule growing up was Tagalog at home and then English outside. But of course, it's like that same pride, right? I think Filipino culture, Filipino cuisine is growing right now in the U.S.
Yes, it is, yeah.
To a point where like, I have a few vendor friends who sell like sisig and isaw on the streets at our pop-ups, and people of other, you know, non-Filipinos line up for, you know, our cuisine, right? But there's also, of course, that pressure because we want to represent what it really is, right? We don't want to lose kind of the roots and that connectivity. And I think ultimately, like Filipinos and Philims, sometimes like there is that, you know, rift at times through the diaspora, and I think that's why I'm finding these trips this past year very like, really important, because I've been able to kind of reconnect and also just like learn more about Filipino cuisine, and then going back, I'm now able to really, you know, share that with my team, share that with my colleagues, my peers, and ultimately to my customers, so that, you know, we can kind of bridge the gap a bit more through these small, you know, yes, it's a small like 3-week trip, but it's, I think, important that
it's amazing like how much you're trying to do also in the time that you have here in Manila. So is there something? Have you in your trips back and forth here in Manila? Then have you come back to like to New York and being so inspired by like your trip that you're like, I want to make something because of something that you remembered, you tried something on your trip, and then you tried to make it in your own version or confection?
I think like I still definitely have to tap into like traditional Filipino desserts. I think the best way to kind of like, you know, going back, let's say from in March, was like, okay, how can I source better ingredients that are true to the Philippines?
That's
right?
true.
Without having to smuggle it into the US, right? Because that's not it. Like my brother, because I'm here with my younger brothers this trip, they're like, look, the calamansi is so cheap. You can buy like, I was like, I can't put that in the bag, or else we won't be let in. Or rather, like, you know, for example, like Oro, we brought it up. That company is currently running a new chocolate right now. Like it's flavored hojicha, and hojicha is also growing in the U.S. Right? It's like the new matcha. So because they're the first ones to really like have a hojicha flavored chocolate, I'm like, okay, I'm going to take this, I'm going to bring it back to the US, and I'm also going to kind of like try to inspire that. And yes, hojicha is not necessarily traditionally a Filipino ingredient, but it still plays into the Asian Americanness, Asian culture. And Oro being a Philippine-based company, it still does connect ultimately to the bigger picture of bringing Filipino commerce, business, and cuisine into the U.S. Through the medium of chocolate.
Yeah, and again, it's just so fascinating that we're just talking about the concept of chocolate, not even savory foods. Yeah, we're talking chocolate and like how much you can like stretch like the flavor of chocolate. I was just thinking while you were talking, like, what if you made a confection that looked like sapin? Like, cause I'm thinking of like colorful desserts that we have, and we have a lot like halo-halo and everything.
Yeah, like one of the more out there things that like people try to have me do, and it's still on my radar. I haven't said no to it completely. Definitely just a lot of R&D is to make like a durian bonbon.
Oh, okay.
That's pretty out there, I'll be honest, like for the Western palate.
Yeah.
Another one that might be quite weird is if you've ever had like a gummy candy, right? Yeah. There's a French version of that that's pretty like, it's called pâte feuille. Okay. Someone has suggested making a banana ketchup pâte feuille.
Oh my god.
Again, it in theory it works.
Yeah.
But
like you can imagine it, but then will it?
I still have to try it and make sure that it works.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Okay, like at least mine was like still on the sweet side.
Yeah.
Right?
I'm clearly going a little.
Not too exotic, not too outlandish. Now, what can you impart now to Filipino aspiring Filipino pastry chefs, chocolatiers? Granted, you are like what, 24, but you have accomplished so much. Okay, and I'm sure, but you've been exposed to so many different environments in the industry too. So knowing what you know now, like about the kitchen, the art, chocolate, and everything, what's one thing that you can share with aspiring pastry chefs so that they can thrive and survive in the industry?
I think you have to be crazy.
Crazy, I love that.
It's because of course, like it's long hours. It's not necessarily always the best pay. It's also quite intense, right? It's like, you have to produce X amount of stuff in such a short amount of time.
Yeah.
But ultimately, crazy enough that you have this crazy amount of passion, if you will, right? Where like at the end of the day, yes, like I need to produce like X amount of bonbons, but let's say I pop out 32 out of the mold, and they come out super, super shiny. Like for me, it's just like, wow. I love what I do. And it's those moments, or another moment that I usually talk about is like, okay, when you produce a dish or produce a cake, that moment where the family or the client or whoever commissioned it like gets it and they smile, they're excited. That's the moment sometimes for us that we're like, we made that memory happen. And as long as you keep that same passion for sharing memories, for food, for your ingredients, and again, the level of craziness to do that, then I think people will usually stay in the food industry because of that.
Yeah, and just because you have also worked in fine dining restaurants, which I want to ask now, what was, okay, the quote from the article is like, you fell in love with the fine dining environment, like at least, well, back of the house, basically. So what was it? What was it about the fast-paced environment there?
I think it's, I've always explained it as like, we are addicted to the high. Because of course, in those high, like very scientifically, right? When you're in those moments of high, like stress, your adrenaline is so like up there that because you've reached that point every single night for 5 nights straight, practically, your body craves it, right? It's very weird. But I think ultimately it's this. It might look chaotic if you ever eat in a restaurant and it's an open kitchen. Because the last restaurant I worked at in Manhattan was an open kitchen.
Yeah.
And there's like 20 chefs, 20 cooks in this small kitchen. It might seem chaotic, it might seem loud, but there's an organized chaos and there's a dance going on.
Yeah.
I think comparing it to a dance is the best way. Where like back at Manhattan, there'd be two, for me at least, my time there, you'd be 2 pastry people. One person in charge of the tickets and scooping ice cream, one person in charge of the 3 desserts coming from the oven. And let's say the 3 desserts would be a souffle, a date cake, and an apple tart tatin. Each of which would be 12 minutes, 3 minutes, or 1 minute in the oven.
Every second
counts.
So
let's say each ticket would be different. So I remember back then having, let's say, 20 tickets, and I would have to memorize, not have to, but I just would memorize at least half of those tickets. So I'd be like, my partner back then, her name would be Rachel. I'd be like, Rachel, the first few tickets are 3 souffles with 2 date cakes with an apple, right? Followed by 3 souffles with another date cake with 5 apples. And then you would practically remember 10 tickets in. So the mental strain, physical strain and everything. But for some reason, it's that organized chaos that makes it work and you enjoy it. Some way, somehow. And there are days that I definitely miss it. Would I necessarily give up everything right now to go back? Maybe not.
You're more chill now.
A bit. But I think yes and no. Because of course, yes, I'm a bit more lax, of course, as my own boss. But there are definitely still moments that, even though I own a chocolate shop, there are still moments where I'm very Michelin-esque. I think one example that relates to my trip here in the Philippines in March. I had a volunteer student while I was teaching my class at Enduran, and it's just like my question, like it would be back. My chef would do the same thing, all right? So let me just preface that. I remember asking the volunteer, like, okay, do we have 450 grams of this? And they're like, chef, no, we have 350. I was like, okay, so the answer is no, right? So it's like, because I didn't ask how many, if we had 350 or whatever. I asked if we had 450. Anyway, but yeah, so there are just those moments that that the Michelin chef still comes out.
Yeah, I mean, but yeah, that's why you learn so much also from that environment, from Michelin restaurants too, because like as stringent as it can be, like with the way that like chefs run their kitchen, there's still so many lessons that you can learn, and that's how you also kind of like improve in the way that.
Definitely, I think those are definitely high intense, right, fields, right, where unfortunately like there is no time kind of to take the step back in the moment, right? Where like you just have to somehow learn from that experience, either in that moment or post that moment. So like, you know, mental fortitude, I think is another one where it's like after a while you just have to take it.
Yeah.
You know, of course you don't want to work in a toxic environment.
Yeah.
But I think right now most places in terms of like restaurants or kitchens are not as bad as they used to be. I have colleagues or other chef friends who are like in their 40s, and they talk about how they used to have like pots and pans thrown at them.
Yeah.
So like that kind of culture is kind of gone now, but there is still that intensity sometimes that like, you know, you have to kind of understand that it's nothing personal, right? If chef's screaming at you, it's not because they don't like you.
Yeah.
It's primarily because, you know, the person that you're about to serve could potentially be a very big food critic,
right,
or big influencer, and if you know, are lacking or slacking for one dish or for that one moment, it could make or break the business sometimes, right? So, yeah, it's very high intense, but you definitely learn a lot about yourself, how much you can take. You learn where your limit is at times.
Definitely.
And I think, you know, if you ever reach, and you know, for any viewers or listeners, if you ever reach that limit, you know, that's when you know when to call it sometimes. Like, okay, I'm gonna step away. Let me see if I can find a different place, or, you know, address it, right? But then you also learn how to grow from it, right? Okay, if this was my limit, then how do I go about it? What did I do wrong? How do I go about it? And so on.
Can I just say, when you were describing like your situation, like when you were working in the kitchen, there were like 20 tickets. You triggered my trauma, Daniel. I'm just saying, because I was a food runner and I was the one expediting also. So it's just like really, like, so the intensity. Granted, it wasn't a Michelin star restaurant, but then it was a fine dining restaurant. So you have to really be at your best, at your peak. And so for the 20 tickets, and to really communicate with the kitchen, like, this is what we need, like, all day, like, even if you're in the weeds and everything. See, I still know some of the terms. And so it's exciting to also know that you are all in this together. You're all working towards similar goals.
Ultimately, like, the restaurant can sometimes be disjointed, right? Where it's like, it's the pastry team, it's the savory team, it's the front of house, it's the sommeliers, whatever. But ultimately, everyone works for this collective goal of, let's have a great service. And that's a quote, right? Like, I remember at some restaurants, that would be the final kind of like chant, like, let's have a great service.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just really like, so yeah, it really brought back memories for sure. when I was young and I was a food runner and everything. So it's a really interesting experience. So if you monsters actually want to try, and actually it's encouraged, you should work in the food service industry at least once to know what it's like. So at least you know how not to be a Karen. You know. So I'm also going to ask now, like, when you finally put up your store, right? So it's come full circle. You have you've put up your store. What were your feelings then? You know, seeing your name on the signage, seeing the storefront of Daniel Corpuz Chocolatier. What was that like for you?
I think it's daunting, right? It's scary, right? But I think, like, me opening the shop, the main location in Chinatown, New York City, the reason why I opened it was it answered this question that I always got, because I always just did pop-ups, right? The question always was like, where can we find you? And then the answer would always be like, oh yeah, well, this week we're there, that week we're there, and then next week we're not doing anything. But then the other week, it's like, it was always not consistent. So the location's in Canal Street Market. It's this food hall that's on Canal Street, New York City.
Yeah.
And I actually did pop-ups there beforehand, right? Like one off, one weekend off, whatever. And they just so happened to have a space on the food side. And I asked, I was like, hey, is anyone interested in this? I was like, they were like, not at the moment, but if you are, we could talk about it. And yeah, I mean, that was like, I toured the space fully in like February 2021, right? 2022. And then I opened June 2022. So we actually just celebrated 1 year last month.
Oh, happy anniversary!
Thank you very much. But yeah, it's very daunting, but very exciting as well. As a business owner, of course, I use more of the business degree now versus the pastry.
Okay,
Where making pastry, making chocolate can be easy.
Yeah.
Heavily quote that easy. But yeah, just knowing that I have to, wear different hats as a business owner. I have to be HR, I have to be marketing team, I have to be social media team. And yeah, it's still very fun, don't get me wrong.
Yeah,
but it is a lot of work.
And I mean, as someone but the good thing is that you do have the degree to help back you up in the business side of things too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that does help, and I think that's where a lot of small business, hobbyists, that's where they kind of find where they're at, where sometimes they have a product, they have something that's going well, they do, they're selling something from their house, and there's a lot of people that order, but how do you go about running and making that into a lucrative business?
Right.
So I think for myself, I'm fortunate that I have that degree to kind of go through my notes back in school, because of course I wasn't necessarily always listening back in college, so I do have to refer to my notes. It's like, okay, this is the issue, this is the problem, what is something here that we did in one of our case studies or something that I can now use? And I think kind of one of the, one example for example, right, the last pop-up I did was in Times Square. And I adopted kind of a very, even though I'm a very high-end chocolate shop, I actually took one of our case studies back in school, where we analyzed a fast food chain and kind of saw how can we expedite orders, and adopted that into that pop-up. Where, for example, right, we would have the lines, and I would have 2 other employees in the line taking orders, allowing us to be able to push items out faster.
Yeah.
So stuff like that, right? Where it's you back in school, I'm sure I was like, oh, why are we learning fast food if I'm going to open a restaurant or whatever? And yet I'm able to use that into what I'm doing now.
Yeah, in hindsight, it's kind of just well, thank you for teaching me that.
Right?
Then.
Right?
Yeah.
I'm just okay.
Now it comes in. Now it actually works. So now we are nearing the end of the show, but I do want to know, because in New York City, in the East Coast, there's a community, right, of Filipino restaurants, and there are a few recognized shops. Some of them, like you mentioned off air, they're just they just pop up wherever there's going to be an event. And so I want to know, do you guys have a group mismo na you guys either it's collaboration or you guys all coming together for a community pop-up, or is there healthy competition also?
Yes. So I think I'm fortunate that I'm actually a committee member of this organization called Philippines Fest. We are trying to become kind of one of the biggest Filipino kind of street fair events in New York City.
That's fun.
We have about 30 plus Fil-Am Asian American businesses that, and the main crux of this, collective of businesses is to showcase and share Filipino culture through different media, right? So we have a lot of food vendors, right? We have people who do barbecue, lechon. You have myself, who makes kind of re-envisioned Filipino desserts, right? Reimagined Filipino desserts. But then we also have vendors who, let's say, are that sell jewelry, right? Filipino-inspired jewelry, like pamaypay earrings, or let's say another one who uses Filipino traditional hand-woven fabrics from here in a lot of what they do and sell in New York. So there is truly a community in the U.S. on the East Coast And I think right now, Filipino cuisine, Filipino culture is on the rise. More and more people are aware of what Filipino is, what being Filipino means. And I think we over there are kind of like defining and redefining, in a way, what it means again, as Filipinos, right? And the fact that, like, again, the last event that we did was in Times Square. We had a whole block with almost like 24 Filipino flags flying in Times Square.
I love that.
And tens of thousands of people showed up to support us as small businesses. I think is a great accomplishment. And if anyone out there who's listening in the US or anyone who's like starting a small business, like banding together, I think, like you said, is healthy competition. But it also, like, as you kind of get to know these people that you're competing against in a way, you ultimately see that the bigger picture is, collective growth.
Yeah, and it's the same thing as like in being in the kitchen. It's working towards like a similar goal, and that's really bringing more awareness and more appreciation for Filipino food and culture. And so for Filipino food too, I feel like it's been a long time. I hear it, I see it in trends reports before. Even when I was in college, like doing like what are the trends now and everything that you have to write a paper on. You would see like there's Filipinos that Filipino cuisine that's like mentioned, but then now it's like it took a while to get to this point now where we are being so recognized and people are being so amazed, which I guess as Filipinos, like, you guys should have known about this before. So I love that you guys have that community and that you guys have that bayanihan of sorts of like just helping each other and helping the Filipino community there, and also spread Filipino like awareness in food, in culture, and in basically our hospitality.
Yeah. And I think it's like right now, if you look at it, at least in the US, more and more people now know that Filipino food is not just lumpia.
Yeah.
Because for the longest time, everyone was always like, oh, it's lumpia, lumpia, lumpia.
That's so true.
And there's just so much more. And the fact that people are, again, going back to like, say, like the barbecue or like lechon, or like, people are willing, non-Filipinos also are willing to wait in line, try isaw, try sisig, try flavors like calamansi, pandan, and so on, because it is very different for some people.
Yeah, and so it's really amazing, and I really hope like you guys will do more pop-ups also, and maybe I don't know, like maybe you could do something here.
I think ultimately one like goal down the line is to bridge the connection between this Fil-Am business community and the Filipino business community here. And I think in my own small way, I'm able to do that. Funny enough, there was someone who owned a coffee company earlier that showed up at one of my pop-ups today, who was like, yeah, we're coming to New York. I'm like, oh, if you are ever interested, this is a platform that is available for you.
Nice.
Of course, we just have to think of logistics.
Yeah.
But if that's something of interest for people here who are going to the US, that's by all means, that is an option.
I love that. It's just amazing what you're doing as a chocolatier, but also helping the Filipino community over there in the East Coast, at least in the East Coast. Maybe you might even do something in the West Coast and then bridge
Coming
that.
soon.
Yeah, bridge that and then across the Pacific and then bridge that too. Who knows? So yeah, like I mentioned, we are already nearing the end of the show. Before we go, why don't you go ahead and plug what else do you have in store in Manila? What else where can we probably see you, find you, if you're gonna be doing a pop-up, and so we can try your stuff too.
So I mean, I'll still be here in the Philippines hanggang next Friday.
Okay.
I do have a pop-up in BGC this week. Tomorrow I'll be there, and this weekend my products will be available. Check my Instagram. That's kind of the best way to kind of like find my stuff. But it seems like I'll be coming back into the Philippines more and more than I thought, right? I was here in March, I'm here in July. There might be something down the line in November, December. So, like I said, best way to keep up is kind of just like, finding my Instagram. I'm also the only one who also like manages it. So if you shoot me a message, I will actually also see that. But yeah, next week I definitely will be around in BGC. There's also a very big kind of food expo next week, so I've been invited to go there. I'm very excited to again build and grow this network of colleagues, chefs, and small businesses that I've been able to create and make for potential collaborations and projects in the future.
Yeah, and if you need a host.
Yeah, there we go. Right now,
for one of those events, or all of them. I'm just kidding. But yeah, no, I would love to be a part of this as well. So in the process of you eventually pursuing that dream and reaching that dream too. So that is basically it, guys. That is the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me,
Daniel, for joining us this evening, talking to us about chocolate and making me wish I had chocolate right now. Also because I mean, it was a lot of chocolate talk, right? And also about pastry chef, being in the kitchen, the industry itself, but also more importantly, different ways how we can, represent our heritage. So, and I love that you're doing that through chocolate, and because nobody really says no to chocolate, unless they're really health buffs and whatever.
Every once in a while I meet someone who's like, I'm allergic to chocolate. Well, I'm like, well, I can't do anything about that.
Yeah. So there we go. Thank you very much to all of the monsters. Thank you so much to Daniel for joining us. And if you guys want to go and see and taste actually some of the confections that Daniel will be making, do follow him on his Instagram, and that is
Daniel Corpuz, so DANIELCORPUZ.
There we go. So that is it, and catch me again next Thursday for another guest. So for the meantime, keep it locked only here on The Monster. Bye, good night.
Monster exclusive interview. Monster exclusive interview. Only from Manila's hottest.